In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, the calm of a quiet summer dawn was shattered by the thunder of artillery and the roar of thousands of engines. From the forests and fields stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, three massive German army groups burst across the border of the Soviet Union. Within moments, the largest invasion in human history had begun. More than 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of tanks, trucks, and planes, were now storming into Soviet territory. It was the start of Operation Barbarossa. Adolf Hitler's boldest, most ambitious, and ultimately most disastrous gamble. To understand how this moment came to be, we must step back to the years leading up to 1941, to the ambitions and paranoia of one man who believed he could reshape the world. Adolf Hitler, the self-proclaimed Führer of Nazi Germany, had risen to power in 1933 with promises of restoring German pride and rebuilding an empire. By the late 1930s, he had already achieved stunning victories. His forces had crushed Poland in just weeks in 1939, conquered Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, and by summer had overrun the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. To the world, it seemed as if Hitler's armies were unstoppable. Europe trembled before the power of the Wehrmacht, a modern, mechanized force that combined speed, precision, and devastating firepower. Yet behind his victories lay a darker vision. Hitler had long dreamed of conquering the vast lands of Eastern Europe and Russia to create what he called Lebensraum, living space for the German people. In his mind, the Slavic people were inferior, and their lands were destined to serve the German race. But there was one problem. In 1939, Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement shocked the world, as it united two ideologically opposed regimes, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. Secretly, the two powers divided Eastern Europe between them, with Germany taking Western Poland and the Soviets taking the East, along with the Baltic states and parts of Romania. For a brief time, both nations pretended to be allies. They traded raw materials, oil, and machinery, but deep down, neither trusted the other. Hitler saw the pact only as a temporary move. In his mind, a confrontation with the Soviet Union was inevitable. As early as December 1940, he secretly issued Directive Number 21, which outlined the plan to invade the Soviet Union. The operation was named Barbarossa, after Friedrich Barbarossa, the medieval German emperor who once led crusades to the east. Hitler believed this campaign would destroy what he called the Jewish Bolshevik state and secure Germany's dominance over Europe. The plan was massive. Operation Barbarossa would be the largest military invasion in history. The German forces would be divided into three main army groups. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, would advance through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor Bock, would strike through Belarus toward Smolensk and then Moscow. Army Group South, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, would push through Ukraine toward Kiev and the rich farmlands beyond. In total, more than 3.5 million German and Axis troops would participate, supported by 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and over 2,500 aircraft. The Soviets, despite warnings from British intelligence and even their own spies, were unprepared. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, refused to believe that Hitler would break their pact. Even as German troops massed along the border, Stalin ignored the reports. When Soviet reconnaissance planes spotted large concentrations of German armor and artillery, Stalin dismissed them as provocations. He was convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war while still fighting Britain in the West. But Hitler's confidence was absolute. He believed the Red Army would collapse within weeks. He told his generals that all they needed to do was kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. He was convinced the Soviet Union would fall before the winter, allowing him to redirect his forces against Britain. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the first German artillery shells screamed across the Soviet border. Within minutes, the skies were filled with the roar of bombers as the Luftwaffe struck Soviet airfields, railways, and communication centers. In the first few hours alone, more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many still on the ground. Soviet soldiers, asleep in their barracks, awoke to explosions and chaos. The border defenses crumbled under the speed and power of the German assault. The Wehrmacht advanced with breathtaking speed. Using the tactics of blitzkrieg, lightning war, they encircled Soviet units before they could react. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded and destroyed within days. In the first week alone, German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing thousands of prisoners and seizing key cities like Minsk. The scale of the invasion stunned the world. The front stretched over 1,800 miles, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. It was not just a military campaign. It was a crusade driven by ideology and hatred. Nazi propaganda portrayed the war as a battle for the survival of Western civilization against Bolshevik chaos. In reality, it was a war of extermination. Behind the advancing armies followed SS death squads, known as Einsatzgruppen, whose mission was to eliminate Jews, communists, and anyone considered undesirable. Entire villages were massacred. The invasion marked the beginning of the Holocaust on the Eastern Front. Despite their initial shock, the Soviets soon began to recover. Stalin, who had been paralyzed with disbelief in the first days, finally addressed his people on July 3rd, calling for a great patriotic war to defend the motherland. Factories were relocated eastward, far from the front lines. Millions of men were mobilized. The Soviet people began to fight back with astonishing resilience. Yet the Germans continued to advance relentlessly through the summer. By August, Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group South captured most of Ukraine, while Army Group Center smashed through Belarus and approached Smolensk, only 200 miles from Moscow. Hitler believed victory was close, but beneath the surface, problems were emerging. The vastness of the Soviet Union stretched German supply lines to the breaking point. Roads turned to mud after rain, and vehicles broke down constantly. The soldiers faced exhaustion and hunger. Worse still, the Red Army refused to collapse. Soviet troops fought stubbornly, often to the last man. At Smolensk, German forces faced fierce counterattacks, delaying their advance for weeks. By September, the High Command debated the next move. Many generals urged Hitler to continue toward Moscow, arguing that capturing the Soviet capital would end the war. But Hitler overruled them. Obsessed with economic resources, he redirected forces southward to capture Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. This decision would prove fatal. As the German armies turned south, the weather began to change. The warm summer days gave way to cold autumn rains. The roads became seas of mud, a nightmare known as the Rasputitsa. Tanks and trucks sank axle-deep, slowing the advance to a crawl. But still, Hitler pressed on. In September, German forces surrounded the city of Kyiv, trapping nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers, one of the largest encirclements in history. It was a stunning tactical victory, but it delayed the push toward Moscow by precious weeks. When Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow, began in October, winter was already approaching. The soldiers had no winter clothing, believing the campaign would end before the snow fell. As temperatures dropped below freezing, their weapons jammed, engines froze, and frostbite spread through the ranks. Yet despite the brutal conditions, the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow in early December. They could see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. But then came the turning point. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive.
Fresh troops from Siberia, trained and equipped for winter warfare, stormed the frozen front lines. The Germans, exhausted and freezing, were forced to retreat. For the first time in the war, Hitler's army had been stopped. The failure of Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Hitler had underestimated the Soviet Union's strength, its people's determination, and the harshness of the Russian winter. His dream of a quick victory turned into a nightmare of endless war. By the end of 1941, over 750,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Millions of Soviet civilians had perished, and vast regions lay in ruins. The invasion, which Hitler believed would secure his empire, had instead doomed it. The Eastern Front became a brutal war of attrition that would consume the German army for the next 4 years. Operation Barbarossa was more than just a military campaign. It was a clash of ideologies, a confrontation between two totalitarian regimes that reshaped the 20th century. It unleashed unimaginable suffering and destruction, but also revealed the resilience of the human spirit. In the end, the same arrogance and hatred that drove Hitler to launch Barbarossa would lead to his downfall. The failure to conquer the Soviet Union turned the tide of World War II, leading ultimately to the fall of Berlin in 1945. And thus, the dawn that began with fire on June 22, 1941, ended in flames 4 years later, as Hitler's empire burned to ashes, destroyed by the very war he had unleashed. This was the true history of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion that changed the course of World War II forever. History is full of moments that remind us how ambition and arrogance can destroy even the most powerful empires. Operation Barbarossa stands as one of those moments when one man's obsession with domination led to the suffering of millions. If you want to explore more incredible true histories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History WWUS, where we bring history to life one story at a time.